So, I know I'm late to the whole Cyberpunk train, but I still want to make a video about it, so I'm just gonna do that. I think I have an interesting perspective on the game though, that I don't see a lot of other people have. The main thing is, I never followed the game until basically a week before the release. Never saw a trailer, never read a thread, nothing. Another interesting thing is I played the tabletop game, like Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, and incidentally Cyberpunk Red, which is the game I run a campaign in. So I know a lot of the lore and how RPGs like that should work, like how Western RPGs should physically work, especially in the context of that universe. Also, I'm going to split up the video into 3 parts because otherwise this video would be really incoherent. So I'm going to split this video up into 1, things that actively harm Cyberpunk, basically things that just like don't work for the game. 2, things that are kind of whatever. This is more kind of a neutral feeling, something that I don't really feel like praising or despising, but is still worth mentioning. And then 3 things that I think help the game, you know, the good stuff. So if you just want to jump around the video, there'll be time codes below and should be split up into chapters. Alright, let's just go then. Before this goes any further, I would just like to say that I wrote and got all this footage from when the game was on patch 1.3. Some of the stuff in this video is been fixed or has been changed. If I notice any, I will put text on screen that says this has been fixed in patch 1.5. And if there's any like visual bugs in the game footage, just know that that's probably either been fixed or ironed out, or they're working on it, whatever. Either way, whatever. First, you should know, if you haven't played the game yet or you care about spoilers for this game, just know there will be spoilers in this video, absolutely. So just fair bit of warning, click away now if you care. And with that, let's get into the bad. So here's the main thing. There's explanations for why a lot of things in the game is bad, and I'll explain a few when they come up and when I feel like I have like enough knowledge on them to be able to actually explain things. But there's other things that just shouldn't be this bad for an RPG. So it's going to be a bit of both. First things up, I'd like to talk about life paths and how they handled them in the game in comparison to Cyberpunk Red. In 2077, it's how you pick your background before the game starts, and it's the same in Red. The difference is the amount of options and customizations. In 2077, you get to choose between 3 hard and true life paths. No customization, no fidgeting, no putting your own twist on it, nothing. While in the Red, there's flowcharts for literally everything. You could pick your race, styles, sentimental items, friends, enemies, tragic loves. Do you have them? Do you don't? Ideals, principles, family backgrounds, history, as well as ethics. That's just the flowcharts for just simply your background before the game starts. Not only that, but you have flowcharts for each class in the game. Like for a netrunner, what's your workspace look like? For a tech, do you have an assistant? For a medtech, what do you specialize in? For a lawman, what kind of corruption is in your precinct? Also, say you have option paralysis like me and there's too many options. Well, if you want, you can roll your background with dice and let RNG decide your past. So here's the thing. I get that this level of customization would be nearly impossible to have in a video game. There's just too many variables and too many changing factors from within the game. But I don't think that can excuse just having 3 options. I think a better option would be to give you 3 options, or maybe even more, of Nomad, Corporate, or Street Kid, and then open up a different menu that gives you 3 customizable options, similar to how they do it in Red with the classes. So say you pick a Street Kid, the next menu would be, what gang did you run with? Who's gunning for you? And why do you stay in the streets? Or something like that. For gangs, it could be like Sixth Streets, the Valentinos, Tiger Claws, or so on. We don't need the level of customization that tabletop RPGs give us in video games. I understand it is nearly impossible, but a little bit can go a very long way. Aside from that, game design-wise, there's a few things. One being the side quests. In 2077, when you get a possible side quest to do for a fixer, they show up like this, which doesn't really tell you much, and I'm fine with that, but here's the thing. There's a couple of very, very good side quests that I feel should be shown more prominently, and I'll give you examples. So one was where I went out to this trash mound in the Badlands, and I found a refrigerator. In that refrigerator, I found Rosh Bartmoss. So this is a very big world building moment. The lore around Bartmoss, if you don't know, is that in 2020, he was the best netrunner in the world, and he hated corporations and saw them as the ultimate oppressor of humanity. He was constantly under threat of death from corporate raids. So he did what he did best. He went to go hide in the cryogenic freezer disguised as a refrigerator, which had life support and net access in it. There, he made Datacrash and Rabbids. After creating them, he hooked them up to a dead man switch, and when a corporate raid finally found him and killed him, in a matter of a few months, the net was 78.2% infected. Which is bad for corporations, obviously, because basically Datacrash grinded the net use to a halt, dumping stock value of corpse, corrupting data, releasing countless military-grade AI, which was then mutated to be extremely dangerous and hostile. After a few years of trying to solve the problem, that's where Netwatch made the Black Wall, which sectioned off the remaining part of the net from the areas that the crash had consumed, and where the rogue AI stayed out. Just to illustrate how bad this was for their world, corporations and governments went back to using punch card technology for data entry because the net was so unusable they just couldn't fix it for that long. And then also, when the Black Wall was finished, they no longer let the net be a worldwide thing for everyone. It had to be privatized and heavily monitored out of fear. All because of a dude I found in a fridge in a junkyard because I happened to click on a completely random and identical side job mission on the map. Like, Johnny Silverhand and Rosh Bartmoss honestly may be two of the most important figureheads in the time of 2020. Like, they both entirely changed how the world ran in their own ways. And he's just here. A dot on the map that says the exact same thing as every other dot, which signifies a side mission. Okay, but maybe it's because nothing really comes from that mission, which is true. You don't even really learn a whole lot about Bartmoss other than he crashed the net with this insane virus and Johnny liked him. But even then, there are other missions that are really different and weird and they're just really cool, but you'll never find them because they're in a sea of yellow dots on the map. So in this random alleyway in Haywood, you find this mission, you walk up to it and find a corpse clasping at a gun. You grab the gun and realize it's a gun with an AI friend in it. And he, let me tell you, is very quirky.
Can I change your name?
No.
Why not? Considering I'm your new owner.
Increasing volume by 300%.
From there, you get a gun that is personalized to your liking and talks to you. My favorite thing is that if he's set to Stone Cold Killer mode, he'll just ruin your stealth by shooting someone and just being like, I don't know why I shot him. Just kind of wanted to. And this one's even worse than the Bartmoss one because at least Bartmoss is in an area where there's not a whole lot of other side missions. But this one's in the middle of fucking Haywood, where there's like millions of other side missions to take up. There's this one quote in regards to game design that was said by H-Bomber Guy in his Fallout 3 video that goes something like this.
What about all the side content? I think a good case study here is Fallout 3, because like I said, 3 has some great stuff in it. Some of the quests, the superheroes in Canterbury Commons, finding a violin for Agatha, and deciding the fate of the Oasis, are interesting and often meaningful stories. They're genuinely good quests. If you can find them.
If you look at it, Cyberpunk does have a lot of ways of letting you know when a cool mission is about to happen, or the main story, which you have to do anyways to get the ending of the game, so it's not like they really need to hook you in. But otherwise, if there's like a really cool side job that the devs want you to play, there's no way to differentiate that from the 80th cookie cutter Wakako job about killing tiger claws and getting back an item for a client. Alright. Only a few more things I'm going to complain about and then I'll move on, I promise. The next thing has to do with reactive dialogue in the game. Well, actually, it's about how it doesn't exist. When playing this game, you end up doing a lot of big name things, doing jobs for Rogue, helping the Aldecaldos, helping Judy and the Mox, capturing a high target scientist from Kang Tao, etc, etc, etc. But only towards the last 2 story missions do people stop questioning you and they stop rep checking you. You could be super reliable, never failed a job, completed every optional objective, and you can still be told, well, you're still new, so I don't care what you have to say. Like what? A great example is at one point you're talking to Rogue. This is, I think, about halfway through the main story, and she hits you with the only thing you're known for is fucking up that Dex job or something along those lines. This is an open world game where side jobs can happen wherever and you can do a lot of them. Hell, you could have 40 rep by this point and she'll still say that.
Bruh.
And I get it, it was in the main dialogue during a storyline, so they won't be able to change it, or maybe they didn't have time to make it dependent on rep level. But if that's the case, then I got a really easy option for them then. Just don't have her say that. Just have her say, you've done a lot, but there's still more to prove. This illustrates her understanding that by this point you've made some waves, but you still need to prove yourself more before getting her full trust, which is totally fair for someone like Rogue. And listen, you may be saying, well, most games don't have this, but that's not even true. Fallout New Vegas does this with almost everything you do. Help the NCR? Gets mentioned on the radio. Help Freeside? The Kings help you fight and give you free shit all the time. Kill Caesar early? Literally everyone recognizes you and praises you for this. And listen, that can sound like a really tall order to accomplish in an RPG, and I would have more sympathy for CDPR if Obsidian hadn't made Fallout New Vegas in a fraction of the time. I know they were able to reuse assets from Fallout 3 and such, but Jesus Christ. Another game that does this really well is Red Dead Redemption, both 1 and 2. You do something good, people talk about it and treat you differently. You string some poor bastard up and tow him behind your horse, people talk about it and treat you differently. And are you ready for the hot take? Skyrim, possibly one of the worst AAA Western RPGs to ever come out from a major dev company, even had that. Skyrim, you know, the game that's been sold for the last 10 years and had the story fidelity of a wet napkin. Yes, that Skyrim. So why does this matter? Here's the major reason, and game masters do this all the time in tabletops. It makes your world feel really alive. Let's say you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. Let's say you, ironically, kill a dragon. Oh. The town nearby should look at you like heroes, not as some whatever the fuck adventuring party. Like, let's say your party goes to the bar. Have an NPC offer to buy your party a drink. Make the tavern owner offer them free rooms upstairs for taking care of their dragon problems. It solidifies the fact that there are consequences for your actions in an RPG. Instead of saving that town from the dragons, let's say your party goes all murder hobo and completely raids the town. Well, now they have a bounty on their heads, they're fugitives, enemies of the country they're in, and now bounty hunters will be sent for them unless they turn themselves in. Huh. I wonder what game has done that before. Oh yeah, Fallout New Vegas. The goal of an RPG is supposed to be immersion, because you're supposed to be role-playing as your main character. You're supposed to have to make tough choices because there are real consequences at play here if you decide to undercut the fixer and work directly with a client. Maybe that fixer will talk to their friends and suddenly you can't get work with fixers in that area anymore. Maybe you piss off Biotechnica. Well, then they'll send a couple solos after your group since you've pissed away their money and time. And let's say you kill the solos. NPCs should acknowledge that you did that. It makes the world feel alive. The only time that 2077 does this is with your agent. If you call up friends and allies on your agent, you can talk to them. And you can ask them questions or, just talk with them. It's neat. It makes them feel real. But of course, they only have like one dialogue cycle before you've used up all your fun tokens. The only other way I've seen them do this is on the radio or in the news. Sometimes you'll see a reporter reporting on jobs you've done, which is nice. But honestly, that's more like a GM telling you that you did a good job rather than showing you that you did a good job. The most alive this world ever felt to me was on a random side mission, of all things. I was walking around Santo Domingo and ran into the Aldecaldos doing a gun deal with some scavs. They were just there, doing their thing. You can try to help them and the scavs recognize you and you kill them and the Aldecaldos are a little upset because you messed up their deal. But they say thanks for helping them in a fight and leaving. That felt more real than 80% of the rest of the game. That one side quest made the world feel more alive than almost anything else in the game. And once again, it's just a random dot in a random corner of a huge map that looks like every other random side quest dot. For a world to feel alive, you need to have your NPCs interacting with each other. You need to have your world keep on moving even if your characters aren't, interacting with it. It needs to be constantly moving and changing, and people need to be talking and being around each other. And existing, and all your NPCs need to have opinions on each other, if they would know each other in the first place, that is. It's not easy, obviously, for a video game, but it's been done, and it can be done. And it's pretty essential for an RPG to feel immersive. That's the whole point of an RPG. Another thing I'll mention, we need to talk about the hype buildup CDPR did for 2077. So, I'm a huge Western RPG fan. It's basically as close to tabletops you can get without getting into MMOs. I love Fallout New Vegas, Oblivion, Baldur's Gate, Disco Elysium, Fallout 1 and 2, and many more. But the issue is, it's not a huge genre. So small, in fact, that before Disco Elysium came out, I would say there hasn't been a good one since Fallout New Vegas. A lot of games have elements of RPGs, like The Witcher, for example, or Fallout 4, but they aren't like full-on RPGs. So when I found out about 2077 a week before the release date, I was excited. But I wanted to be surprised. So, like I said earlier, I didn't watch anything or read anything about it. And when I played it, I thought it was pretty good. And I very distinctly didn't get why so many people were angry. Aside from the obvious like tech difficulties that the launch had and how poorly it ran on last generation consoles, I understood that, trust. But I started to make a lot more sense when I went back and watched a lot of their old promotional material and looked at some of the old postings on the 2077 Reddit and a few other forums. CDPR, in general, just bit off way more than they could possibly chew and had to dial it back very quickly. They were promising what seemed to be the most in-depth, advanced Western RPG ever really made, along with them promising way too much as well as them being way too public about the project when it was still in its infancy. People started spreading totally legitimate, quote, leaks about the game. Things like, you can have a relationship with every NPC in the game, including ones you see on the street. Which is completely insane. Who the fuck would ever believe that? You literally have to be an infant and not have any understanding about how programming goes at all to think that that could possibly be done. And listen, I don't know how to program, and even I know that that would seem like a nightmare to do. But I guess you all know the answer to that. It's a bunch of fucking gamers. So yeah, that tracks. So CDPR had to scale back the game to be able to get it out sometime in this decade. How did they do that? Well, you have to strip away what makes it complicated. And the game slowly went from a true, honest-to-God Western RPG to an action RPG that you can kind of influence, not really though. So here's where I should probably describe the difference between Western RPGs and an action RPG. So to me, a Western RPG is a game that tries to emulate tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, Cyberpunk, Fate, Vampire the Requiem, so on and so forth. Obviously, you can't literally be a tabletop RPG and emulate it perfectly because that'd be impossible to foresee every action that anyone would ever want to do. But you try to get as close as you can. And now an action RPG is something like Skyrim, Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and I mean Cyberpunk 2077 as well. Basically, it has elements of an RPG, character creation, stat allocations, dialogue boxes, etc. But you don't get a whole lot of choice in the end of the game, and you can't really impact the world in a meaningful way. A good way to look at it is kind of like mixing a Western RPG and a JRPG. JRPG being a Japanese RPG, and generally in JRPGs, you don't really get to influence a whole lot in the story until the endings, where some of your choices will amount to whether you get the good ending or the bad ending. And they take elements from Western RPGs like character creation and stuff like that, where you make your own character, and mesh it with the kind of story structure that a JRPG has, where the choices don't matter quite as much, but you get to choose basically between a good ending and a bad ending. That's how I would describe it. So if you're making a Western RPG, you should have a lot of choices within the game, and those choices should have consequences, and those consequences should impact the world around you. And what I mean by choices should impact the world is what I was saying before, consequences for the actions that you take within your game. For instance, in Fallout 3, you can't kill story NPCs. So if you shoot them, they just kind of get back up. You can launch a fucking mini nuke into them and they're just like, nah bruh, it's all good. Let me just T-pose over here for a bit and get back up. Which is bullshit. In New Vegas, wanna know what happens when you kill, I don't know, the president of the NCR? Nothing. He gets killed, people don't trust you as much in the NCR, some people are angry with you, but the story continues. It just looks like you'll have to find another way to bolster the troops and maybe get some more morale up for the final fight. And I know it's really hard to build a world that makes that possible, but the issue is that when you have the characters that are too important to die, it breaks immersion so fucking much. If I want to shoot up the afterlife, I should be able to. Also, I should be rightly punished for doing so by getting locked out of the ending where I need to talk with Rogue. And I should also be punished in terms of having like solos come after me, having mercenaries come after me, being locked out of the underworld of Night City. Like, I should feel punished for doing that, but I should be able to do it. Say I kill Panam, good luck with having that ending now, as well as the romance option. Listen, in the Cyberpunk Red Player's Handbook, it literally tells you to have a minimum of 3 backup characters, because yours can die in a fucking second. And they do. A Cyber Psycho with a grenade launcher does 66 damage. A lot of characters in the game have somewhere between 50 and 25 health. They could either die immediately or obtain a critical injury and be very close to death. All it takes is one bad perception roll. Recently, in one of my sessions, one of my characters who was playing a nomad was on a rooftop. He missed a perception check and didn't see the solo on the other building with a sniper rifle pointed at him. He got shot once and took half of his health. He's a level 4 nomad, so excuse me if it annoys me that in a video game you can't just murder or try to murder anyone. It would totally fit the world too, and not having that just makes it easier but sacrifices the feeling of difficulty that the setting is supposed to give you. So yes, after that very long and convoluted explanation, yes, Cyberpunk to me isn't a Western RPG, it's an action RPG, which at the end of the day doesn't really matter until you advertise your game as one of the best Western RPGs to ever come out, which they did a lot. It's the same reason that a lot of people, and myself included, hated Fallout 4 so much. Listen, it's been a while since a Western RPG has come out that's actually been decent. No one was asking for the greatest RPG ever imagined. People just wanted a decent one. And once again, much like Fallout 4's release, we got an action RPG, which isn't the same thing. Last thing I'll touch on, which is obvious and I won't talk much about, but it's the complete and obvious technical failure of the game on launch. Like, I think if you're aware of Cyberpunk at all, you're probably aware of the glitches and absolute bugs that are riddled within the game. And I know this wasn't necessarily their fault. They got rushed into releasing the game through shareholders, but it's still really not good when you've advertised your game as a Western RPG and it's actually an action RPG, which is completely different in a lot of ways, and also your game just technically is not working correctly. That just adds a lot of fuel to the fire. And let's not even go into how it ran on older generations of consoles. Like, oh my god, it was really bad. But I think that's enough bitching and crying about this game. Let's move on to the things I just kind of felt about. Okay, so this category is kind of confuses some people, I've found, which is totally fair. It kind of would confuse me if I wasn't the one who made it. But this is just stuff that doesn't really make me hate the game or take me out of it. It's more just kind of nitpicky stuff and annoyances and things that are just kind of like whatever. First thing I'll get into is the cat controversy. First thing I'll say, if you're one of the people that are bitching about the cat in the game, fuck off. This is a super petty thing, but it makes me really angry, so we're going to talk about it. So in the Cyberpunk universe, animals go pretty much extinct in Night City because there was a bunch of animal-borne diseases that reeked all the way through all the pets and animals that could be had in Night City, so they had to kill them off basically. That, and as well as high taxes because the diseases are technically still around but not really. So pretty much nobody has animals in Night City. They're super expensive, and not only are they super expensive, but they're kind of dangerous to have. Not only the diseases, but also because a lot of people in Night City are very poor. And so if you're poor and starving and you see a stray cat over in the alley, you may be able to imagine what might happen next. Which is why in the stakeout mission with Goro, you guys have this bonding moment over this cat, and V says this.
Do you see it? That cat?
Fine looking feline. Thought they'd all disappeared from the city.
It is the first animal I see in Night City, except cockroaches, of course.
In the original release of the game, you could find a cat, but it was pretty hard, and you had to find the right kibble to court him back to your apartment. And the right kibble only showed up in a couple night markets. just in absolutely empty parts of the map. Like, there's no reason to go to this night market, which is pretty much lore accurate to the way it's represented. Not only that, but as I said earlier, V even mentions this all in the game's cutscene. Not only this, but you can find the explanation about the diseases and such in a shard in the game as well and read about it. So, people got a little fucking stupid and complained that it was, quote, too hard, and so CDPR changed it. Now you can find cats actually pretty easily, and it's easy to get them, making that bonding moment with Goro really out of place, and also no longer lore accurate. Even in Red, when rolling for things that are important for your character in your backstory, you only have a 1 in 10 chance of getting a pet. It's pretty restrictive of what you can have too. Not only that, if you do have a pet, it has to kind of be a secret. Due to the diseases that pets used to carry, landlords charge out the ass if you have one. The city also taxes the shit out of you too, and in general, you kind of get weird looks for having a pet. Like, having a pet in this universe is like some multi-billionaire type bullshit. Now, this doesn't really affect the game in any major way outside of that cutscene. It's just kind of annoying. While everyone is bitching and complaining about how the game is unplayable, people choose instead to focus on the, ooh, I can't have my little cat friend. So they fix that instead of taking the time to actually fix parts of the game that aren't polished, which is what really annoys me. Anyways though, that doesn't really matter, but I'm just really fucking peeved about it. Next thing I'd like to bring up is that buying things in the game doesn't actually matter. In 2077, you can buy clothes, guns, cars, motorcycles, etc. And at least in my experience, I've only ever bought clothes and bikes on one playthrough. The playthrough I did before I wrote this review, to even see if it was worth writing. And clothes are super fucking expensive and don't give you that much in terms of passives. Unless you're inept at playing a super simple video game, you'll never really need those passives. You can just pick up whatever clothes get dropped by enemies and be totally fine. May not pass the fit check, but I mean, honestly, in a single player game, who really cares about that? The cars and bikes were kind of worth it, but they were also super expensive, and honestly, Jackie's bike is pretty good, so it doesn't really matter that much. The only reason why it was worth it is that it was faster by a decent amount, but generally, it didn't save that much time, so it didn't really matter. Just honestly, there's no reason to do any of this. And I've checked gun stores multiple times throughout the game, and my guns were always just better than whatever they were selling in the shop. The only ones that were ever better than my gun was the ones that were level locked for me. It honestly just seems like a lot of the clothing and gun options just never really scaled properly with where you were. Which doesn't matter a whole lot, it's just kind of annoying and useless. The drop rate on those things for enemies are just better anyways, so it doesn't really matter. Next thing is that, man, driving does not feel good in this game. I was really tempted to move this into the bad section, but the main reason I kept it here is that it may be a little too nitpicky. It's not like the other things in the bad section where it's like the base of this part of the game is bad. It's just kind of a thing that you have to deal with. But the driving just feels like too light. It feels like none of the cars have any traction in the game. But when you hit a light post, it sounds like a fucking freight train is crashing. Your turning radius is shit as well, and if you try to drift to turn a bit better, you always spin in 180 degrees. There's almost no chance of controlling it at all. Bikes are a bit better in the sense that you have a bit more control, but they still aren't really that good. The driving felt so bad to me that on my first playthrough of the game, I never did Claire's mission, because the driving just felt so bad that I wanted to do it as little as possible. The final thing I'll talk about in this section is that there is a clear, distinct lack in difference between builds in this game. Like, aside from body or dex, no other skills really matter in this game. I usually play dex and intelligence, but every time I've really played either cool or technique, it's just been basically the same as before. I just can't quick hack that well. And even then, you can still quick hack, it just doesn't do as much damage. Also, really quickly, can we just talk about how there's like literally no charisma build in this game at all? Like, holy shit, I get the Fallout New Vegas' speech was broken, but Christ, dude. This is the other end of the spectrum, which is non-existent. Also, a little tangentially related, I know some people were peeved by Nick saying that you're not a good netrunner even if you have a lot of points in intelligence, but he's right. If you have like a 20 in intelligence and a lot of quick hacking, you're still just a multi-class solo. For instance, in Red, I have a character named DIY. He's a netrunner who multi-classed into media, so he has 4 levels in netrunner and 2 in media, which is basically the same as V. He's basically a level 4 solo with 2 levels in netrunning, whereas Nyx is just a netrunner, so like a level 6 netrunner, no multi-class, which is why he makes that comment. Anyways though, I think the nitpicking is getting a little bit too much and alienating a little too many viewers. Let's move on to things that I think they actually did kind of well. So here's the sad thing about this review. I started this review because I wanted to try to put a positive spin on this game that's been endlessly dunked on for the past while. Issue is, the more I started writing this review, the more I realized that I actually had a lot of problems with the game. The bad and S section literally took up 9.5 pages in this script. Out of the total 11, I mean, Jesus Christ, dude. Anyways though, the biggest thing I think they did amazing on is the city. The actual architecture of the city is amazing. A lot of games have a really hard time doing this one thing, but CDPR really nailed it. I mean, I've been on to like random rooftops in the city, no mission there, no side missions there, nothing. And everything was set up so well. There were just like NPCs wandering around. It just looked like a cool little like hangout spot that they had made up on the roof. Not only that, but when I started walking around the roof, it led me to a ladder, which then took me up the set of stairs to a nearby street. I don't know, I just think that's really cool. Like there's actual designs here that like lead you places and take you back to different places. It's so cool. I don't know. It just like worked that way, like an actual city would, and it just made me really happy. There's all these cool little sections of the city where there's no reason for them to really look as polished as they do, but they're just like really sick looking. Like, in all honesty, they did an amazing job putting Night City to screen. Each section has the same, like, kind of general vibe, but their own flair added on top of it. Watson to Kabuki, to Little China, to Pacifica, it just all looks so beautiful. I even really like the emptiness of the Badlands. It just fits so perfectly. And as someone who plays the tabletop, I'm just really impressed in how great they made it look. The next thing I'll talk about is the culture of Night City and mercenary life. It's really hard to properly describe it, but this kind of like stoic depression and nihilism that a lot of them has, just the kind of like, you know what, there's a good phrase that describes this, that's the way it goes kind of people. Like a lot of terribly depressing shit happens, but they just kind of like move on and improvise their lives around it. The general culture of Night City is kind of like that, just dealing with gangs, corporations taking advantage of everything that breathes, and just general shit like that. They nailed it. This sort of like nonchalant way of going through life while everything is falling apart around you. Oh, actually, you know what? I have the perfect picture for this. Here. On top of this, the culture around nomads they did pretty good with too. They sort of like romanticized rough and tumble life. They lead like devoid of Night City society. It's just so like they did such a good job of like showing all of this. Even in regards to the fact that it's really hard to make friends in Night City. Like that sort of just lonely life you live in a major city. In Red, when rolling the backstory of your character, you get to see how many friends you have. You have to roll a d10, 10-sided dice for those of you who aren't familiar, and then you have to subtract 7, meaning unless you roll an 8 or higher, you don't have any friends from your backstory. That really indicates the culture of Night City. And also a really small thing I'll mention is that I think they did a good job of informing you on some important historic events within the universe. Like in a game, you're aware of Bart Moss, you're aware of some of the corporate wars, you're aware of active gangs as well as some older ones, aware of like corporations and how they treat people, and on and on and on. Is there more they could have done? Sure, but I think they hit a lot of good bullet points. Last thing I'll talk about that's good, I think, is the story. The characters in the story are just really good, and the story, while kind of rush feeling, is good. I also do like how there's not really a happy ever after ending, because nothing in the Cyberpunk universe ever is supposed to end well. Again, I mentioned it before, but in Red's handbook, it tells you to make multiple backup characters because characters just kind of die often. I mean, fuck dude, like the quote unquote good ending of the game is that your character has 6 months left to live. Like that should say something. Anyways, back to the story though, like the story is just really beautiful and emotional. The NPCs like Panam, Judy, Rogue, Johnny all feel really alive. Their decisions within the game never feel like writing room-esque, if you know what I mean. It never feels like somebody else trying to understand another person trying to guess what they would do. It just feels like natural. They all feel like they have their own character arcs throughout the story, tragedies, personalities, especially Johnny. For all of his super crass, super anarchistic tendencies, he's a really sweet character with a lot of depth if you start going down his storyline. Honestly, my only wish is that the story was longer. Maybe one day though. So after this video, let's just collect our thoughts really quickly. My friend used this analogy once to describe 2077. It's like looking at a good game through frosted glass, and I think I agree with it. Like, there are so many parts of the game that are really good and that are at least decent, but there's something like just not quite right or good enough. Like, they executed some things beautifully, like the city environment, the culture, personalities, etc. But then everything having to do with immersion is done so poorly. Listen, I've been playing tabletop games for 6 years and I've been running my own for 2 years. The biggest thing you need to do is get your players immersed and invested in your world. Otherwise, why would they take it seriously? There needs to be consequences for actions. I shouldn't be able to spam healing items in the corner if I'm getting my shit rocked without taking a debuff. Even Fallout New Vegas doesn't let you do that. They at least give you a debuff for taking too many stim packs. The same thing goes in Cyberpunk Red. You can take hypos, but they do end up giving you debuffs if you take too many of them. In all honesty, the thing that killed the game, in my opinion, is the scope that they went for in the time period. Listen, the reason New Vegas was able to do it in 18 months was because they weren't trying to make a giant living city. They made a wasteland, and they reused assets from 3 a lot. And even with that, they had to cut content on top. But I think the most insidious killer of this game was the marketing. The hype that it built up for years around this game was insane. And honestly, they marketed it like it was going to be video games too. Obviously, you all know the ending of that. It didn't deliver, which a lot of people will endlessly hate it for. But I think you can still appreciate parts of this game, even though it didn't deliver what was promised. But who knows, they're actively updating and fixing the game. We may have a No Man's Sky situation on their hands. And if we do, I'd be okay with that, honestly. Now, here's the question on everyone's mind. Do I think the game is good? And is it worth buying? I would say it's okay. And if you like action RPGs, then sure. If you have a cash burning a hole in your wallet, then do it. But honestly, I would just recommend finding some friends and playing Cyberpunk Red instead. It's a pretty simple system, and tabletops are a lot of fun. After all of this, 2077 could have been better. But it isn't the worst game on the planet. There's a lot of rough parts to it, but there's also some really pretty good parts of it. Hopefully, they continue to make it better as time goes on. So some really quick final notes about Cyberpunk. I'm going to really quickly say that I'm not trying to bite. I'm just going to talk really quickly about how if you want to go like way deeper into like the problems with Cyberpunk and the problems that came up with releasing, came up with the things that were really good, things that were really bad. The action button review of Cyberpunk 2077 is a fucking masterpiece. Genuinely a masterpiece. And I think the biggest thing that he said was that Cyberpunk is a culmination of all of the problems that modern gaming has. And so to critique Cyberpunk is to almost critique the gaming industry as a whole right now. I'm not going to go into depth though, because that is his video. He talks about it a lot, and I think it's a very good ethos. It's a very good argument to make. I think it has a lot of validity. The other thing I wanted to say was that like the whole point of me basically railing on this game for like 20 minutes and then at the very end to be like, oh, I think it's pretty good though, is to just try to nail into the people's brains. You can criticize something that you like. It's okay. You actually should. I think criticizing the thing that you like is an easy way to figure out like why you like it. Because without figuring out why you like something, you're just kind of floating. And I don't know, that to me seems counterproductive. Like Cyberpunk is a very, very broken game at times, but also a very like touching game with a really, really sad, touching story about like humanity and how we are able to adapt to like anything really. I don't know, I think if the game gets patches, which it looks like it's going to hopefully keep getting patches even after 1.5, it will hopefully be like really good. Anyways, that was the whole point of me coming on here and saying that, is that like I really wanted to just hammer into home that like it is okay to criticize something that you like. I think that's a really important thing that we have lost kind of sight in almost on the internet. I think that's a problem with Twitter, honestly. I think Twitter, it's hard to criticize something that you like because you only have like 240 characters or whatever. Like, I don't know. Anyways, that is the end of my review. Thank you everybody for watching. I really appreciate it. If you consider just subscribing or sending this to a friend, it really helped me out. That's all I ask. If not, then you're totally fine. I don't care. It's up to you. You all have a good rest of your day.